Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Sure the clicker works first. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so as Peter said, my name is Anup Chalisey, Professional Head of Infrastructure at RSSB. Today, the agenda, I'm going to go through it quite simple, just a bit of background, talk about current standards, and then I'll summarize the talk. So the purpose of this presentation is to discuss the role of standards with regards to sustainability. And by the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that all of you here will have some clarity and food for thought regarding that. So sustainability, what is it? So we've had some really good talks this morning about sustainability. And if I were to ask 20 people in the room, might have 20 slightly different answers as to what sustainability means to them. So in this instance, I'm going to give you a bit of background to what sustainability means to the railway. And I think, and then that's something that's being set at the moment. So, and that specifically is the Sustainable Rail Strategy. So what is the Sustainable Rail Strategy? I'll go through these first. There's a whole load of policy the government has published in the last 2 years. So it's given the transport sector and specifically the rail industry several important policy instructions. These instructions have increased expectations that rail respond in a coherent and efficient manner. The most pertinent to sustainability were these six, and that's the UK government social value model, the Great British Railway, the William Shapps plan basically, decarbonising transport, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, Rail Environment Policy Statement, the Environment Act, and levelling up. I'm not quite sure if that's still going to happen at the moment. So each of these firmly underline our government's commitment to the sustainable development and growth of our railways. In particular, the Rail Environment Policy Statement provides rail with clarity on several environmental issues, and they were kind of shown in the earlier presentations. And these, and as well as that, it outlines priorities for the next 30 years as committed to in the William Shapps Plan for Rail. So these form the basis for the Sustainable Rail Strategy, and these policies set timetables for actions in many areas, including air quality compliance by 2030, biodiversity net gain by 2035, removing diesel-only trains from the network by 2040, net zero carbon rail by 2050, and the Scottish Government has even more ambitious commitments across many of these areas. So, as I said, rail is embarking on a transformation. It's a 30-year strategy, and we have a whole industry strategic plan which will set a clear and unified direction for the railway. And the WISP, or the whole industry strategic plan, over the next 30 years has 5 objectives: meeting customer needs, delivering financial sustainability, contributing to long-term economic growth, levelling up and connectivity, and lastly, delivering environmental sustainability. So sustainability must be built in, responding not only to policy, but also the expectations of customers and communities and investors. The William Shapps Plan for Rail states the need for a comprehensive environment plan that will establish rail as the backbone of a cleaner future transport system, and the Sustainable Rail Strategy will be that plan. So the government have asked RSSB, alongside industry, to co-create the SRS. It will be the first industry-wide sustainability strategy for rail. It will provide a whole industry view out to 2050, aligning the existing rail organisation strategies, some of which were discussed earlier this morning, and highlighting varying commitments where they exist. It's about maximising the social positives of rail as well as minimising the environmental impacts. So, moving on, what is the Sustainable Rail Strategy? So it's broken down into 3 kind of themes: the what, the how, the who. So this is the what. You can see here there's quite a few topics, and they're broken into three areas, and that's social, emissions, natural resources. And I think it's quite nice to have those presentations this morning because they kind of give a bit of background to what I'm going to talk about here. So there's the social side, which is making sure that the people that work for the railway, it's sustainable. We're helping keeping the right people in, and ensuring there's diversity and inclusivity. In terms of emissions, we talked a lot about CO2e this morning, and also natural resources. We also spoke about that in terms of making sure we're prepared for a changing climate. So I might be going over a little bit of what was discussed earlier, because I've chosen two topics specifically I thought would be of interest to us engineers in the room, just to give a bit more kind of specificity to it. So one is net zero carbon rail. So it's a railway that's central to delivering a net zero economy by 2050. And as you can see across the top, you've got your strategic areas, and then on the side, you've got the milestone, when we hope to achieve those by. So today, rail is directly responsible for about 1 to 2% of transport's carbon emissions, and approximately 0.5% of the UK's total emissions. The total carbon emissions of rail, not just directly from its own activities, but also indirectly through its value chain, were calculated at 9.5 megatonne CO2e in 2019. As the industry's largest emitter, Network Rail is responsible for almost 2/3 of this footprint. Due to its role in managing fixed rail infrastructure, rail's next highest emitters are train operating companies and freight operating companies, mainly due to emissions from traction engine. So in order to kind of combat that, the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force was set up in 2018, developed a vision for industry decarbonisation, and recommended a balanced combination of electrification, hydrogen, and battery trains to decarbonise traction. So Network Rail then published the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy in 2020, identifying the technologies that can deliver net zero carbon traction. However, it's infrastructure rather than traction which contributes the largest component of rail's carbon footprint. And infrastructure carbon covers all emissions associated with construction, maintenance, renewal, and end of life of rail assets. And that was kind of shown earlier this morning. And just to kind of touch a bit more on this slide, you can see I spoke about traction decarbonisation, and it highlights all diesel trains only removed from network by 2040. In terms of infrastructure decarbonisation, there's a commitment by 2030, all cars and vans within the rail industry have zero emissions, so we'd imagine electric. But it also says by 2030 and 2040, and eventually by 2050, we have to commit to reducing our carbon footprint by X amount from where we are today. So that's an ongoing conversation, and that X, hopefully we'll have a number for that X at one point, but that's an unknown. And then obviously there's other stuff like modal shift, get more people to use the railway, moving away from cars. So that's a kind of snapshot of net zero carbon rail. Moving on to the next slide. Once again, touched on this morning, climate adaptation. So prepared for a changing climate. So that's the railway that builds in adaptation and continuously enhances its resilience to climate change. So what is it? I think everybody understands what climate change is, but I'm going to go over it just because, for me, there are a few words here that kind of made me think differently. So climate change adaptation is a process of adjustment to actual or expected climate, and in its effect, making climate resilience in change in the railway ensures the entire rail system can anticipate, absorb, adapt, and recover from climate impacts. And this includes adverse and extreme weather conditions and changes in weather patterns, vegetation and pest disease distribution. Adaptation is more than an ability just to bounce back and recover from adversity, and extends to the broader adaptive capacity gained from an understanding of the risks and uncertainties in our environment. And I think that's the most important bit of that paragraph, which is, as well as just adapting and recovering from problems, it's making sure we design to make sure we understand the risk of the changing environment. Climate change will increase the frequency and severity of extreme weather conditions, which can and do damage assets, disrupt services, and have broader impacts, including safety risk, legal challenges, and loss of reputation. These will lead to increased costs and liabilities and decreased revenues. Implementing climate change adaptation measures offers the industry resilience to disruptive events and will reduce further costs and safety risks. So the current situation where we are at the moment, I think is some really good examples again this morning. Rail is one of the leading infrastructure sectors on climate change adaptation in the UK. Network Rail and Transport for London submit adaptation reports to the government currently, and major projects such as High Speed 2 and East West Rail are developing good practice in building climate change resilience into design. However, I think it's fair to say there's inconsistency across the industry, with infrastructure operators being generally more advanced than other organizations. This means a whole industry understanding of asset and system vulnerability and risk is lacking. A broader, similar and coherent approach can support enhanced adaptation across the entire system. And the key barrier to development of this coherent approach to climate change adaptation include a lack of resource and capacity, industry driven by standards which take time to update, repairs and maintenance focusing on like for like rather than better, difficulty demonstrating the value of resilience investment, and a largely reactive approach to resilience investment, such as in response to significant events such as Dawlish and Carmen tragedy. So what needs to be done? So as well as all that's up here, climate change adaptation is integrated, and I think a few things that Colin said, a few things about it. We need to develop the skills and guidance to enhance decision-making in this area, and that's training. We need continued collaboration amongst each other, as well as with government and regulators. We need to integrate climate change adaptation into policies, standards, and procedures. So it's not something you need to do in the next 5 years. It's as and when they come up, you need to integrate climate change adaptation. We need to incentivize resilience through and adaptation through funding mechanisms, contracts, timetables, and ways of working. And we need to just change the culture to ensure people can talk about it and they're not being pushed away. So that's kind of a very big ask and a very big challenge, but that's kind of what it's talking about here in preparing for a changing climate. So earlier on, I touched on the what, the how, and the who. So the who is the industry roles, and that's who the actors are expected to follow up and implement the strategy. And the how, these are some common solutions suggested. So for example, if you have electric rail, it would cover 2 or 3 of the what, for example, quieter railway, net zero carbon rail, clean air, maybe a railway for nature, and moving on to zero waste. So these are kind of some solutions they think would cut across a few of the topic areas. So I thought I'd just touch upon a few of them, and I've touched upon a few topics, but I did think it's going back to the industry roles. I think I want to talk about our responsibility. I don't think, and this is not prescriptive, and you get the slides, but I think it's, I don't need to say too much on this because once again this morning, I think as an industry, we are taking responsibility. I can see that we're taking responsibility. We're understanding we have a role to play in this, and that we already started. So this kind of outlines in each topic area what infrastructure would be expected to do as a minimum. There's obviously more to do, more than this, but as a minimum, this is kind of outlines what needs to be done. So I've spoken about the strategic rail strategy. It's out it'll be out on the RSSB website in the next month and a half, hoping to be published early January. I do do recommend you have a look, and this would be the industry agreed way of how we're going to define sustainability and what our way forward. But before I go on to standards, I did want to touch back on policy again, because I think it's really important to just go through why we're doing this in the first place. So I touched on before decarbonising transport and the rail environment policy statement. So in terms of decarbonising transport, you hear, I'm not going to go through all this, but that's kind of there on the policy. That's what we need to aim to do. So, you know, it's got renewable energy, it's got the carbon emissions, it's got the air quality targets, and this is kind of what government have said we need to achieve. Once again, going back to decarbonising transport, from the government, again, they want to reduce, you know, CO2 emissions greatly, and that's kind of the targets eventually by 2050 being a net zero rail network. So obviously all this means we're hoping that there'll be some money, and I'll get into that later on. So I'm setting the scene here. So moving on to standards. So standards, we all know they're very important. They keep me in a job, but they're very important. They're ways of implementing policy, best practice, R&D, innovation, all these things. But not all standards are made the same. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that before I go on, just put it into context. So at the highest level, we have standards that ensure you meet the law. And they can be NTSNs, ENs, BS, railway group standards, and so on and so forth. Then you have other standards. You have your company standards, your railway industry standards, standards brought up by contracts, and so on and so forth. And then we have standards below, which are either adopted on a voluntary basis or as best practice or guidance. So the reason I've done this is just to say that not all standards are made equal, and we'll have there'll be different responsibilities throughout the industry for creating a certain level of standards. So moving on, national standards. Actually, before I get into this, before I kind of came to the last 2-3 months, I've pored over God knows how many websites looking at what standards are available for the railway in regards to sustainability. And actually, there's little to no standards out there that will help us as engineers make decisions. So I've just talked about the strategic rail strategy. I've also discussed and shown you the policy. There's going to be a huge amount of documentation or support required so people can understand what's being required, what the industry wants to achieve. Some of that will be done through standards. So one of the things we need to do is develop all those raft of documents. And when I use standards, I use it in the more ubiquitous term. It could be guidance, it could be anything else, or best practice. But those certain documents. So I had a whole load of examples here, but I can use the examples from this morning because they're probably more pertinent. So national standards, we spoke about sleepers. You know, they're normally for an IM to decide for themselves. But if we're really serious about this, do we create a standard that says follow the BSEN for your sleeper, but actually here's the carbon by which the minimum carbon or maximum carbon this sleeper can emit for it to be considered to be used on the railway? You know, that type of thing. So we could do national standards that cover things like that and other design principles. Company standards. We could move to making sure we're quieter railway. So changing equipment. So when we do night shift, we don't disturb our neighbours. We could make sure we build into our contracts with the supply chain, similar conversation from earlier, you know, how do we reduce carbon in the supply chain? So those could be company standards. And finally, I think the design standards. And this is probably one of the most difficult ones because we talked about circular economy. You know, how do you design something that we think is going to last 30 to 50 years and then be reused? Do we mean reused as in recyclable or actually reuse elsewhere? How do we design track forms, for example, that is more specific to the geology of the area and therefore it lasts longer? A bit more expensive, but actually lasts longer. And the examples I've given aren't exhaustive, and they could be fit in multiple tiers of whether it's national, company, but those are the type of things we need to be thinking about. So really the thing I'm saying is it's not my responsibility, it's our responsibility to develop these standards. So next time you're doing a review of a standard, just do think of this and say, can I embed sustainability in these requirements? But I've skirted two very, very important issues here. Money and risk. Two very important issues. So money, I thought this meant money doesn't grow on trees, but it looks like trees grows on money. That's not what I meant. In order to make these changes, or to create these standards or do any of this, there needs to be committed funding from the government. Or, within the industry, we need to make compromises. Considering kind of the last 2-3 years and where we are now, I think it's going to be harder, probably tougher than it's ever been for a long while. But we need to improve, we need to do something. So what my kind of point here is that we need to be aligned in what we're doing. We need to make sure that everybody understands what we're trying to do. And I think the whole life cost model, all these things need to be brought in. You know, thinking 2 years into the future is not acceptable anymore. It's 20 years, 15 years, 30 years even, if we can. And that comes from the top, from government, down to us. So money is a massive discussion point and needs to be resolved. We can't keep skirting around the issue. The other one is risk. So we may have to change how we view risk. So in some instances, it may mean accepting an increase in risk or a reduction in risk to achieve sustainability targets. And an example, real-life example I can give you is, you know, we've improved massively as an industry in installing and products all around the country, but we do occasionally get it wrong. We've had platforms recently where they're out very minimal, 2 mil, 3 mil, but that's still non-compliant. In the old world or current world, we'd say, can you make it compliant, please? Because that's the law, make it compliant. But is that right to ask now? Do we waste all that extra carbon? Do we waste all that manpower or woman power? Can we ask that if there's no change to minimal risk in the risk profile? So that's a difficult question we need to ask ourselves. The other one is maintenance, for example. Do we need to start decrease our appetite for risk? For example, we have maintenance limits which go quite far out in some cases. Do we need to have tighter parameters to push the life out? So it means being braver, and we'll have to try new things without procrastinating. So I'm going to summarize very quickly. So I set out what I think sustainability means to the railway. I set out the standards framework. And I set out the fact that there needs to be a conversation about risk and money. But looking back at the presentation, I should go back to that. Truthfully, I don't think I answered the exam question, which is the role of standards to enable the change to sustainable infrastructure. It's obvious it has a role, very important one to play, but I don't think I've given much clarity on how it's going to be done. It's an ongoing conversation, and it's not just me or our company that does that. I think as an industry, we've got to have that conversation, and we need to work out how best we go about doing that. But what I do know is that we don't need to wait for standards to get us thinking, and that's already been shown that's not the case. We all have a role to play, and by that I mean, what are you doing to achieve sustainability goals. You might not even agree with what's being put up here. You might say we're going over the top. And that's okay too. Challenge is great. It gets people thinking and people involved. So, like I said, do get involved. It needs all of us to make a change. Thank you.